Hey everyone, my name is Terry Beswick. Welcome to this third edition of the Queer Culture Club, in which I get to bring on friends of mine who are working in the area of queer culture and talk about their work. So this monthly series runs on the second Thursday of every month, and we focus on LGBTQ people who are defining the queer culture of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So tonight, I'm delighted to have as a special guest my friend and colleague, Shayne Watson. Shayne, she, her, hers, is the owner of Watson Heritage Consulting, an architectural history and historic preservation planning consultancy based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her work has been recognized by California's two most prestigious awards in historic preservation, the Governor's Historic Preservation Award and the California Preservation Foundation's Trustees Award for Excellence in Historic Preservation. Shayne is also founding chair of the GLBT Historical Society's Historic Places Working Group, and Watson co-authored the Citywide Historic Context Statement for LGBTQ History in San Francisco in 2016, and was a co-chair of the San Francisco LGBTQ Cultural Heritage Strategy in 2020, which seems like such a long time ago. Shayne, I'm not seeing you. Are you in the show? There you are. Hi.
Hi.
I was getting worried there I was going to be by myself.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, it's fun to bring you on too. It's been a pleasure working with you on numerous projects over the last 5 years that I've been in this role with the Historical Society. And and I can't remember exactly when it was that we first connected, but I think it was probably in 2016 that we came together and we started, or you were the founding chair of the Historic Places Working Group, which became also the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Committee of the San Francisco LGBTQ Cultural Heritage Strategy. And along that process, that multi-year process, we worked on many projects around historic preservation in the queer community. So I don't even know where to begin with you, but maybe Shayne, let's begin at the beginning. Okay, talk to me, if you would, just a little bit about why you got into this work. What is historic preservation, and why is it important, and why is it your passion?
Well, Terry, great question. So I've always been interested in historic buildings ever since I was a kid. My parents would take my brother and me on vacations, and we would just go look at historic house museums and factories and mines and gold country. So I was always aware of the importance of historic places. But it wasn't until I was studying art history in undergrad at UC Santa Cruz, and one of my classes was a focus on architecture, and so that's kind of when my passion for architectural history was sparked. And when I got out of UC Santa Cruz, I just took a shot at applying to one of the 3 best preservation firms in the city. One of them responded, and then I started out as a research assistant doing filing and things like that, and just kind of did a lot of my learning on the job at that place, Architectural Resources Group on the Embarcadero. Interestingly, it was also a connection to ARG, why I got into LGBTQ historic preservation or heritage preservation. So up the street from the Embarcadero, where ARG's office was, they were on Pier 9. And so if you go up the Embarcadero and make a right on Broadway, 440 Broadway is the home, as you know, of Mona's 440 Club, maybe one of the first lesbian nightclubs on the West Coast, if not California. And so I used to walk by Mona's on my lunch breaks, and there were no markings on the building. It was sort of kind of, not in the best of shape, not really cared for. And so when I just was doing research as fun on the side to just see where these historic LGBT sites were in the city back then, this was around 2007-ish, I realized that there were no landmarks associated with lesbian history. And so that kind of turned into going back to school. I went to grad school. I wrote my thesis on North Beach, the lesbian historic district in North Beach, and the sites that are associated with it. And I kind of came up with a preservation plan for how to treat those properties and that history. And then it just kept going from there.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. It's always interesting to, reflect back and say, how did I get to what I'm doing now? And your work has kind of taken multiple paths also. I mean, in my experience, a lot of the work that I've done with you, you've been doing actually as an activist, as a volunteer, I think. But then you also put on your consultant hat and, consult with city agencies and with, private clients, I think. How do you maintain that balance? How does that work for you?
That is a great question, and it's something I'm still working on today. I love what I do. I feel very fortunate to be in this line of work, and especially be able to specialize in the LGBTQ history side of it. It's just incredible, and so. But I do have a tendency to kind of get pulled into these passion projects that aren't necessarily paying my bills. But
I don't know. Is it fair to say you're pulled into them, or you actually start them?
Yeah, touche.
Okay, I totally get that, but most recently, of course, we've been working on the Lion Martin House. Can you talk about that? Just talk, how did you first get involved in that? I know you knew Phyllis. I'm not sure about Dell, but maybe you can just talk about your relationship to that project.
Sure. So, I mean, everyone knows the importance, the significance of this couple, Dell Martin and Phyllis Lyon. And so I was very aware of them when I was doing my thesis work, and then of course they popped up in so many different ways under so many different themes when Donna and I were writing the context statement for the city. So their house, they purchased it together as a couple in 1955, and they lived there until Del Martin's death in 2008, and then Phyllis Lyon's death last year in April. I approached Phyllis Lyon in 2011, wrote her a letter, told her how much her work means to me, how much I was really interested in the time. I wanted to nominate her house to the National Register of Historic Places, and I wanted to do it pro bono. That was kind of like my first major passion project. But it didn't, ultimately, Phyllis and her caregivers and her team at that time decided it didn't make sense to have the house nominated or listed in the National Register. So fast forward to last September 2020, I was just scrolling through Facebook, and an SF Gate ad popped up that said, tiny cottage in Noe Valley sells for $2.25 million. And I was like, oh boy, I think I know what tiny cottage is. And then I think I sent an email to you and just a couple people like, hey, did anyone see this? I sent the article, what can we do? And that's really when we started the conversation. And then we really quickly pulled together all of these different people from the community to form the Friends of Lion Martin House advocacy group. And we're still working on it today. The latest news on that effort is that the landmark did go to the Historic Preservation Commission, and I think that was like 2 weeks ago, and the HPC voted 6-1 to have Lion Martin House is on a double lot. And so there's an undeveloped side, and then which is 649 Duncan Street, and then there's the Lion Martin House at 651 Duncan Street. 649, the new owner wants to build their new house there, which everyone understands they have a right to do. So the Historic Preservation Commission was really favorable to the new property owner, and they voted to support the landmarking and send it to the Board of Supervisors, but they decided to cut out 649 from the landmark address, which means new property owner can essentially design and build a home that will have really little to do with the actual landmark Lyon Martin house next door. So the next step on that is we go to the the landmark goes to the Board of Supervisors, and I think that can be as early as next month. The Land Use Committee first, and then the full board will vote on whether or not to push the landmark forward. But I think we'll have San Francisco's first official lesbian landmark by the end of April or May, hopefully, which is pretty exciting.
And I don't know if there is there another lesbian-specific landmark elsewhere in the country?
Country. Yes, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Right. The home of the Furies in, I think it's in DC.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Great. And for those who may be watching either live or live stream or recording, we should say that Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon were activists, in the LGBTQ community, and particularly in the lesbian community, and the women's community, fighting for our rights, going back to 1955 when they were two of the founders of the Daughters of Velitas, published the Ladder, which was one of the very few publications, LGBTQ publications, but I think one of the very first targeting the lesbian community around the country, and was really a lifeline to a lot of folks, I would say, back then. And so their work over, 5 decades, it was amazing, and really helped to get us where we are today. So that's, that's their story. But, so what's important about designating this house, about, preserving this house in some way, because, people can Google Phyllis and Del, and they can go to our archives and look at their vast papers, collections, much of it digitized. So what's important about landmarking this house, and in terms of preserving their memory or telling the story?
Well, for me, I guess historic preservation in general and landmarking in general, it's important to, or, if you think about a city like San Francisco, the character of San Francisco is that it's just this really rich, diverse mix of old buildings, new buildings, dirty buildings, clean buildings. It's, you go into certain neighborhoods like the Castro where everything sort of, fits together. You've got some adaptive reuse that's gone into, like a row of historic commercial buildings, but it works sometimes. But if we, so that's more like the architecture side for me. I really do. Some of my favorite places I've visited are historic, look at large concentrations of historic buildings. Like those areas just feel different to me. But a place like the Lyon Martin house specifically, for me, it's just, I work in the field of historic preservation, we look to the National Register of Historic Places as the nation's list of the most important places that tell this country's history. And the National Register has something like 100,000 properties on it. And maybe now we have 20 LGBTQ sites out of that number. So, and the same can be said for other groups of underrepresented minority people. History of women on the National Register is a really, really low number. So what we're trying to do right now in historic preservation is change the focus from strictly beautiful architecture and beautiful buildings to, well, what was the history that unfolded in those places? So more like taking it away from the tangible to the intangible. Yes, but for me, it's the historic buildings and historic houses such as this one will be there to tell the story of these women decades into the future, hopefully. If the house is allowed to be demolished, that, their little layer of that history on Duncan Street in San Francisco from that period of, in that period of time, it's like that would just be lost. it just makes for a more interesting street too. I don't know if you've seen Duncan Street lately, but
Yeah, yes. Yeah, we have a lot of development going in the neighborhoods of San Francisco, and small houses coming down, big houses, single family, huge houses going up in the middle of a housing crunch. And in general, I mean, we're just seeing a lot over the last decades. Really, the skyline is changing. Huge development happening, huge displacement happening, gentrification. It's not the same town it was, when I was a kid, or when I moved here in 1981. It's gone through a lot. So,
which neighborhood did you live in 81?
I've lived in so many neighborhoods, but I was actually on McCoppin Street first. That's at that sort of nowhere neighborhood between South of Market and the Mission and Hayes Valley, and I also lived in Outer Sunset for a while. I was just thinking today about how I worked at the Surf Theater, and I was chatting with some folks about that amazing institution which is was lost, but yeah. And I'm thinking about just in terms of like the cultural shifts that displaces people, especially people that are not well off in San Francisco, and that was a lot of the discussion that we had on the San Francisco LGBTQ Cultural Heritage Strategy report, which my biggest fear with that report, which came out in 2020. And was to be delivered. It was established by ordinance, and was to be delivered to a resolution. It was to be delivered to the Board of Supervisors and the mayor, and then they were going to look at our recommendations that we spent countless hours in crafting and wording and prioritizing, and then nothing would happen. And to be fair, there's been a little pandemic going on over the last year, and so it maybe has not been a top priority to look at our report. But do you still see the work that we did there as important, especially from a preservation standpoint? What was in there that would help to preserve our neighborhoods for you, and our buildings and our stories?
Well, I think probably the most important recommendation coming from our committee is supporting. I mean, we consider all of them are important. I think we had dozens of different ideas for action items and recommendations, and had to whittle it down so many different times, pare it down. I think we maybe have 5 now overarching recommendations. Mm-hmm. But I love the idea of what cultural districts are doing for San Francisco right now, and what cultural districts can do for San Francisco. And I think in many ways, I'm excited about watching these cultural districts grow and get more and more organized, because in many ways, it's cultural districts of San Francisco are answering the question of, we can't, especially in a situation such a dire situation such as San Francisco is in, with homelessness and gentrification and people being forced out, and at least prior to the pandemic. We can't just freeze these historic buildings in time. So I'm thinking specifically of South of Market. I'm working as a consultant for the leather and LGBTQ cultural district in the South.
Oh, great! I didn't know that. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're about to start working on the chest report, which, in my mind, gives these cultural districts so much power and funding to invest in their little neighborhood. And I don't know, I see really good things. What are you've had more experience than I have, though. What are your thoughts on?
Well, I was involved for a little while in the Leather Cultural District, and played a big role in the formation of the Castro Cultural District, the LGBTQ Cultural District. But yeah, I think I agree. I think it's really amazing. Actually, I'm so glad that you're involved with the Leather Cultural District and I think what's important, as you mentioned, is the planning process, which is, you know, it's really challenging, you know, for this community group that are feeling under duress with, you know, projects like, you know, the Eagle. You know, let's keep the Eagle going, the Eagle Bar, and then have to turn their attention for a year or two in developing this chess report, which will like lay out what the assets are of the cultural district, and really come up with a strategic plan to preserve the culture of the neighborhood and enhance it and help it to grow. But I think it's important. It's super important to, you know, do that work and take that time to do it while also fighting the battles, you know.
Yeah.
You know, preserving the institutions and the buildings that are there. Do you, and I don't know if we have any chats, comments coming in the chat, or Lee, if you can, and thanks Lee Thaffer behind the scenes. Lee is doing an amazing job in helping us to organize this and many other programs, and he's also going to be facilitating, bringing us questions. And yay, there I see one. How do we join the Friends of the Lion Martin House?
So we have a website we can paste up. Is that right? Thank you. So if you go to the Friends of Lion Martin House, there is a letter you can sign. And if you sign the letter and enter your email address, I can add you to our email list, and you'll hear about our next community meeting, which should be coming up in the next couple of weeks. Right,
where we'll have much more information and updated information about the whole Lion Martin House project, which I think is just wonderful, that we're making progress, and I'm really excited that we're all, I feel like we have a really great opportunity right now to reach consensus with all the parties that are involved in a way that feels really good to everyone. So I really, you know, congratulate you on your leadership on that. But to circle back to, you know, one of the recommendations in the strategy report was that the Historic Preservation Commission form a LGBTQ advisory committee. Do you still see that as important? And can you talk about that a little bit in the few minutes we have left?
I do, and I think in a way this is it's already happening with the I guess again the Lion Martin House is a good example. So in the case of the Lion Martin House, I thought we as a community group would end up having to carry this through the process ourselves. So I thought one of us would have to write the landmark nomination, and then, you know, we would all have to go and advocate it for all of these commission hearings. But it turns out when Supervisor Mandelman got involved and he initiated landmark designation, that kicked the process into a totally different fast track process where the planning department staff write the actual landmark nomination. And then we essentially just show up at the hearings and speak in support of it. So this worked out. It never works out this way. It's never this easy. It never happens this fast. And we never have so much unanimous support. I mean, so this is what's happening here is just extraordinarily good and optimistic and exciting. But what's also interesting is, so what the planner who wrote the landmark nomination did a lot of community outreach herself. She reached out to a lot of people who knew Dell and Phyllis. I did a call for information through our email list with the Friends of Lion Martin House, and we got tons of responses that went directly to the planner. So in a way, we've already got this sort of ad hoc system of community advisors who stepped in and helped out the planning department write this nomination. So it's sort of already there. We just have to formalize it, but we also need to get to a point where it just doesn't seem, there's a little bit of inequity where I just get worried about volunteer burnout with all of the things people volunteer for, and what's the incentive for people to be on this committee?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of work involved, and I know the planning department staff does a lot of research in our archives, you know, and to write up these reports and designations, and, you know, really see what's involved in that. But, you know, I don't know, formalizing an LGBTQ advisory committee to make sure that our issues are paid attention to, in the planning department with the commission, will happen, anytime soon. But I think one of the bigger concerns that has come up in the media recently is that, there were two, I think there are 7 total members of the commission, right? And 2 of them were gay, LGBTQ, and their terms expired. The mayor did not reappoint them to additional terms, including the chair, Aaron Highland. And now, I guess it looks like the Board of Supervisors is not going to approve her nomination of a straight individual. Not to speak to her credentials or anything, but we don't have any queer representation on the commission right now. And is that a concern for you? I mean, how are we going to compensate for that?
Yeah, it is a concern, and I think the last vote at the HPC for the Lion Martin House, Aaron Highland, who was the chair of the commission, he's a gay preservation architect. He was the sole vote in opposition to the way that the landmark was structured in terms of taking 649 Duncan out of the landmark. But he also had some concerns about wanting to see some design oversight. It's complicated, as you know. Taking 649 out means there isn't any design oversight of that house, new house's impact on the existing house. So, but Commissioner Highland has been a supporter of LGBTQ heritage preservation since that firm I mentioned where I first started working in San Francisco. He was a principal at the firm back then.
Oh, okay.
He's been personally supportive of my work, on my thesis, and then going into the context statement, and up until now, he's been immensely supportive. So it is concerning that we won't have any representation on the HPC moving forward. I'm just used to having it there. I'm used to having a lot of cheerleaders on the commission, and I think the other members will always be supportive of LGBTQ heritage preservation. So I'm not concerned that we'll lose our momentum, but we do need representation on the commission.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's worth stating aloud that representation matters, and why. People can be allies, and they can be wanting to pay respect to historically underrepresented community like the LGBTQ community, but there's really, just like for people of color and of all races and ethnicities, and people of different genders, it's like there's no substitution for like having a seat at the table, and that's something I certainly learned through years as an AIDS activist. Is that it mattered, who was in the room when decisions were being made. So, I applaud you for the advocacy work that you're doing on that. And I think, we may go a few minutes over if that's okay, but Lee says we have another question that's come up in the chat. Maybe they could pop it up for us. There we go. Oh, thank you, Gage. Gage asks, he is a heritage preservation grad student working on a digital mapping project of Atlanta's historic queer spaces. That's so great. I'm trying to get something done here like that. Any tips for IDing queer spaces that are most in need of preservation? Yeah,
Terry, this is sort of, so very quickly, the GLBT Historical Society has had an Excel database. Well, I guess it was FileMaker historically, but a database of historic LGBTQ sites in San Francisco. It's an incredible resource. But of course, it's not doing anyone any good in the public or researchers because it's not really accessible. So I think there is some talk that database would then be somehow, so the city of San Francisco tracks its queer spaces in need of preservation through a GIS mapping system. It's called the San Francisco Property Information Map. And so, for example, this report that I worked on for the city of San Francisco, the Historic Context Statement, we identified about 300 something sites, important sites in LGBTQ history in a database. And then we fed that into the city's GIS system. So now every parcel in the city, like the Lion Martin house, if you click on the parcel or you enter the address, some data pops up about that exact parcel, and it will tell you whether or not it's, you know, it's potentially significant for its associations with LGBT history or another reason. But it does send a little red flag to planners at the city that if someone proposes demolition of that property, they're going to need to go through some extra level of review.
Mm-hmm. So,
the GLBT Historical Society's robust database of amazing queer historic sites with, you know, to actually do more of a proactive preservation program at the city level where that data will help protect more sites in the future.
Yeah, so we're trying to move that along. And I know I've spoken with Isaac on our archive staff, and I think they're actually, or maybe they've already transferred it from FileMaker to Excel so that we can actually work with it a little bit better. And that's a first step, but I'd love to see the mapping thing happen. But yeah, to the question, like how to, how like in Atlanta or any other city, how would people, like, what are the source documents that they would need or sources of information to try to identify historic sites to add to their list?
Well, I think one of the greatest, in terms of this type of research in your collection, one of the greatest pieces or collections is the old Gay Guidebooks. So like the Damron guides, which were national, I believe.
Yeah.
They would probably have a section on Atlanta that would then list, from like the 1950s and 60s, I believe, maybe just the 60s. It would list like all of the places that were open in Atlanta at that time. So if you were traveling a country as a gay man, you're in Atlanta, you go to that page and it tells you all of the different bars. So this is pre-internet.
Not just bars, you could also find parks and all kinds of things, meeting places, yeah, and that was one of the principal sources actually for our database, so that's specific, much of that to the men's communities, but there are other historic associations around the country that are specific to LGBTQ. And actually, if you contact our archives, we can help to put you in touch with additional resources. Which, if you poke around on our website, you can also find some information there about other archives and historical associations for the queer community around the country. But Shayne, this is a half-hour format, and now I'm kind of like running a little bit over. My partner's got dinner going. I'm in trouble. Is there anything, any projects that you think are important that need attention right now, in particular in San Francisco, in particular the Bay Area?
That's a great question. I'm looking at Gerard's comment, which I think we should mention. Gerard, oh, there it is. It's a.
Oh, that's great. Okay, cool. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you, Gerard. Professor Eric Gonzalez's Mapping the Gay Guides project is on this website. Thank you so much. Yeah, anything, we've worked on things like from the paper doll to, and we've been working on Castro camera recently. The eagle is being worked on. I just feel like there's so much that can be done in terms of historic preservation work. And I suppose if it's important, then you'd already be working on it, right? So, no, there's more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one example is Glide Memorial Church. Like the reasons Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco is important to queer history, it would take all night to go through those different layers. But I worked on the National Register nomination of Glide for the city of San Francisco. And it's just been stalled. So the nomination is complete. It's at the state level. It's ready to be forwarded to Washington, D.C. But because of Glide's issues with the Methodist Church and all of their, the confusion surrounding, I think there's a lawsuit, it's just stalled. So I would like to start making a little bit of noise about how we can maybe work with Glide to convince them that this would be a good thing for them.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that. Hey, you know what we should do? We should convene a meeting of the Historic Places Working Group of the GLBT Historical Society, and that would be a lovely thing for us to talk about as an agenda item. Is it a deal?
It's a deal.
Okay, that's great. Hey, Shayne, thank you so much for joining me on this third edition of the Queer Culture Club, and thank you everyone who's been watching either live or recorded. Please support us if you can. Just go to our website, glbthistory.org, and you can sign up as a member. There are low-cost annual memberships that are available, and you get some perks, and you support programs like this one, along with our exhibitions and our archival programs, as well as historic preservation work, which is not funded, by the way. So thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Next month, I think we have Natalia Vigil from the Queer Cultural Center as our guest. I'm very excited about that, and thank you so much for supporting us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye, Terry.